Hi, this is a little lecture on social, economic, and cultural rights. And I'm calling it Understanding Positive Rights because that's another term that's used in human rights scholarship to talk about this category of rights. What are we talking about? As you can see, these are some of the things that we often think of as human rights, but that are not guaranteed in our current United States society. In order to understand this, it's important to go back to looking at the historical context of the Cold War. And this map, generally, you can see the kind of blue and purple areas were the Western Europe and the Americas aligned with the US. And the reddish parts of the map show the parts of the world that were aligned with the communist world, or the USSR. And those two areas of the world during the Cold War had quite different relationships to the types of rights that were considered most important. So, if you recall, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1948, and and then groups that were part of that declaration began to discuss how to translate it into something that was legally binding. And that's where we get our covenants, our international conventions, or covenants. That's another term for them. And it took about 20 years before the ideas in the Universal Declaration got translated into conventions or covenants. And they got split into two different parts, one on civil and political rights, which we've talked about, and the US has signed and ratified. And then the other side is the economic, social, and cultural rights, which the US has never ratified. One way of talking about these two sets of rights, well, actually, two ways of talking about them to just organize them in your mind, is that the civil and political rights are often considered or talked about as negative rights. In other words, these are the things where we're saying to the state, keep your hands off me, leave me alone. It's negative. Stay away from me. It's protection from the state, in other words. So if you look at the things on the list here, liberty, a fair trial, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, these are all things where we expect the state not to interfere with our rights. On the other hand, we have the positive rights, or also known as second generation rights, and those are rights that are considered to be the responsibility of the state to make sure people have them. Things like food, housing, decent standard of living, education, health care, workers' rights, and so on. So those are two different sets of rights that are all covered by the Universal Declaration to one extent or another, but have been kind of separated from each other. So just to review, negative versus positive rights. Negative rights are the ones where we're being protected from the state, and those are generally considered civil and political rights. And the other is action required by the state, and those are positive rights. Now, when you really think about it, when you start analyzing how these rights all actually work, are economic, social, and cultural rights really different from civil and political rights? Really, you can see how, in order to have one set of rights, you really need some of the other. So, for example, education is usually thought of as a social right, but in order to have civil and political rights work, in order to have functioning courts, in order to have voting, in order to have elections, in order to preserve that freedom, you need to have people who are educated. And so it's really hard to distinguish those. In order to have good standard of living, we need to have people who have freedom to organize, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. They have to be able to organize, to make choices, to collectively bargain, and so on. So the distinction between these kinds of rights is, in some ways a bit false. These next few slides are screenshots from a YouTube video that I would really like you to spend a few minutes watching. It's just 8 minutes long, and it does a very good job of explaining economic, social, and cultural rights and how they are interrelated. You can see some of the key words on there between the idea of economic rights here, social rights, and then cultural rights, and how they intertwine with each other. So take a few minutes to watch that. I'll give you the link. One of the issues that video addresses is the cost of implementing economic, social, and cultural rights, and that's one of the reasons that they sometimes are controversial here in the United States. So why are these rights so controversial? Two big factors have to be considered. One is the history of American racism and how racism was so institutionalized into American society. The Jim Crow system of legal segregation meant that a lot of political leaders in the 50s and 60s didn't want to implement human rights as they were being developed on the international stage through the United Nations and all of those discussions, because in order to follow those human rights that were being developed, that were supposed to be universal, they were going to have to change a lot of deeply embedded racist practices and laws here in the United States. And so there was a lot of resistance. And in fact, one of the reasons that what we call the civil rights movement, the movement against racial discrimination here in the US, one of the reasons it was called the civil rights movement and not human rights was because the whole idea of human rights became too controversial. Part of the reason it became controversial was because of the Cold War, which was the long period of conflict between the capitalist West, led especially by the United States, and the communist East, in other words, the Soviet Union and all of its allies, China, and all of the satellite countries that were associated with them. And this was a huge and very deep conflict that went on for decades. And I think for younger people today, it's a little bit hard to get in touch with how deep that conflict was. But the idea was that if you think that people have the right to food or housing or health care or things like that, that was considered communist, and so therefore it was considered at odds with the American capitalist democracy. And it ties into all of our American ideas about our exceptionalism and our notions that everybody should just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and all that kind of stuff. So that left us with an ideological legacy that put a lot more focus on civil and political rights, and of course that was only for some people, and led to a rejection of economic and social rights here in American politics. Now, even though I say that, there still are some examples of economic, social, and cultural rights getting put into U.S. legislation. It's just that we haven't signed on to the whole package. So we do have some examples. One is our minimum wage laws. Those were started in the late 30s during the Great Depression. We had something called the Fair Labor Standards Act that governed wages and work hours. Another example is with our food stamp system, currently called SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We've had those off and on since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And then that we have a lot of housing law. As flawed as it is, we at least do have some housing law. And those are all examples of economic and social legislation. These kinds of issues were part of the negotiation. This is President Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King negotiating over the Civil Rights Act. And we think mostly of the Civil Rights movement as being about voting rights and things like that. But in fact, Dr. Martin Luther King moved before he was assassinated in 1968 toward a much stronger focus on social and economic rights as well. As you may know, he was assassinated when he was joining in Memphis, Tennessee. He had joined a strike of the sanitation workers that was going on there, and those were people who were not just organizing around race; they were organizing around their economic and social rights. So let me shift gears here. One of the major ideas, if we fast forward from the period of the Universal Declaration through the split into those two conventions over different kinds of rights, the rest of the UN has been very involved in the last 2 decades in creating development goals for the whole world. And these started out as being called the Millennium Development Goals. And there were steps you can see here on this slide, various steps where the UN adopted some ideas and study plans and implementation plans, and they set 2015 as the deadline for achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Oops, that didn't quite happen. So in 2015, they created a new set of goals, and these are now called the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to introduce you to those in another setting. But that's just something that you should know about, and we'll return to these ideas later in the semester as well.